All right, Mike, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, so the first off is the usual thing. Why don't you tell us how you became acquainted with the intellectual dark web and became a fan and follower?
Sure. I guess just a little bit about myself. I am currently working on a master's degree in aerospace engineering at Carleton University in Ottawa. I have a undergrad background in geomatics engineering from University of Calgary, but I was always sort of interested in, I guess, all kinds of forms of philosophy, different approaches to life, and greater society and that sort of stuff. Um, I grew up in a home that was you wouldn't call it necessarily a religious home. My dad's an atheist. My mom, she is religious, but she didn't do a lot of reading up on it and that sort of thing. But I consider myself a religious person, kind of. I guess you could say non-denominational Christian type. Uh, but I've also always been interested in economics as far as government goes, and I tend to, based on my studies and whatnot, I've always been, or not always, I guess, as I sort of learned more, I was more drawn to sort of libertarian ideas, sort of Milton Friedman type stuff. So I ended up being placed more on the right for most of my life in terms of voting habits and opinions I held and that sort of stuff. It's sort of there's a lot of overlap between libertarian and conservative thought on economics, which is why for a long time I considered myself a conservative. I don't know that I would say that anymore, um, but part of that has to do with conversations I've had with people on the left, people that are more compelling than some others that you see. Like I wouldn't consider figures, like Cenk Uyghur or somebody like that very compelling, but people that are more have some humility, I guess you could say. Um, and I guess just the act of myself changing through discourse has drawn me to intellectual dark web. And I was actually introduced to Jordan Peterson by somebody, a good friend of mine on the left. So I guess that's sort of where I sort of came into the IDW sort of, uh, I don't know, the sphere.
Okay. Well, I think it's pretty interesting that a friend of yours that you consider from the left was your gateway because usually, that's the narrative that the left, particularly the left in the mainstream media, that goes against the narrative they try to peddle. That he's actually a figure of the alt right and a bunch of crazy conservatives who like him. So it's nice to see that this is
That's so absurd.
yeah. Yeah, so it's nice to see that there's sort of a living example that really refutes that. That not only does he have liberal fans, but that these liberal fans are introducing him to other people. Um, that I think is
Yeah,
interesting. But
even people
anyway,
on the right that weren't aware of
yeah,
it. Sure.
yeah. But anyway, I understand as we discussed a little bit earlier in the lead up to this that you wanted to talk about the phenomenon of tribalism, and in particular, you have a way of how it connects to your background in martial arts or something akin to that. Why don't you make your opening statement on that train of thought?
Sure. Why not? So I guess you could say this is fairly relevant, partially because Joe Rogan is an IDW member, and he's obviously heavily connected to the MMA scene. He's talked a lot about Bruce Lee in the past. Bruce Lee is a figure that I have a lot of respect for, and he's driven a lot of my philosophy in the past. I have myself some background in martial arts. I've studied several different styles: Hapkido, Taekwondo, Mijang Luohan Kung Fu, Jiu Jitsu, and of course I've studied Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do philosophy on my own. And I've always found his life to be really fascinating. Um, so I figured, and I promise it's relevant because I find that martial arts, not only is it really deep, there's a lot to talk about in terms of history and philosophy, but it also has a lot of parallels, I think, with kind of the modern cultural war that's going on, you could say. So I figured I would tell a little bit of his story and sort of relate back to some different concepts that are being thrown around right now.
Okay, cool.
So I guess it's just to start off. He was actually born in San Francisco, so he had the fast track to he already had the American citizenship, which obviously would come in handy later on. And he was born in 1940, so this was a really interesting time to be born to a Chinese family, because obviously this was sort of lead up to a lot of mainland China being occupied by the Japanese. So they, instead of staying in the U.S., because Bruce Lee's dad was pretty popular as an opera singer in Hong Kong, they went back to Hong Kong shortly after he was born, and he was raised there. Unfortunately, the choice of going back to Hong Kong was probably ill-advised because they spent the next few years occupied by the Japanese. They had invaded Hong Kong shortly after. Obviously there was the subjugation there. It wasn't nearly as bad in Hong Kong as it was in some areas like Nanking or something like that. But nothing was nice under the Japanese occupation there. So as he grew up, the family made it through that phase. And as he grew up, he was kind of a troublemaker. He was full of a lot of anger and stuff, and he was always getting into fights. He was sort of involved in the gangs in Hong Kong, and he found that he was getting his butt kicked a lot. Because if you've ever seen pictures of Bruce Lee or a little bit about his stats, he's a small guy. He's not big by any means.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of drove him to seek out Yip Man, who is a sifu of Wing Chun, and start learning from him. Ip Man is really well known now for being one of the, I guess, big spreaders of the Wing Chun martial arts style. In fact, there's several movies out about him. I don't know if you've seen Ip Man or
I've
Ip
seen
Man
the
2
first
or
two
anything like
actually.
that. They came
I
out in the
saw
last
them
10
like
years.
5 or 6 years ago. The first two.
Okay, right on. Yeah, that's who his master was. And just a little bit about Wing Chun. It's a style of Southern Kung Fu. Kung Fu is kind of a lot of people would say the grandfather of Eastern martial arts because it's so much older than anything like karate or taekwondo, that sort of thing. They're Korean and Japanese martial arts, and it was sort of split, sort of in the early stages, into Northern Kung Fu and Southern Kung Fu. Where Northern and Southern, it's basically referred to being in regions south or north of the Yangtze River in China. And the Northern styles were very acrobatic, they required a fair bit of strength, high kicks, that sort of thing. And the reason for that, people theorize, is because the diet in the North was there was a lot more wheat and that sort of thing, bread. So they were bigger people. They're bigger people, more muscly. So an example of a Northern Kung Fu style is actually the Shaolin style, which is probably the most classical one, where you see, people breaking bricks with their heads and, hit me with the sledgehammer, I'll be fine. That's a Northern
These are
style.
the bald monks that we
Wing
see on
Chun,
TV, right?
yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Whereas the Southern styles were what we would now call soft styles, because their diet was primarily rice, and they were much smaller people and that sort of stuff. Wing Chun is an example of a Southern style, and you'll see there's a sort of in the lore of Wing Chun is that it was one of the few martial arts styles that was actually founded by a woman. So obviously it was geared to be able to overcome people with greater physical strength than you had. So that ended up being kind of an ideal introduction to martial arts for Bruce Lee. He took to it very well. He was he I don't know, he was very proficient in it. He took his lessons seriously. What part of that is Ip Man, he almost acted like if if Bruce Lee were sort of wrapped up in Hong Kong's what you might have at the time called alt-right scene, where it's a little bit more combative and that sort of stuff, and they like to get into fights and I don't know, they're very I don't know. Anyway, Ip Man was almost like a proto Jordan Peterson to Bruce Lee, because he would encourage his students to get away from the gang fighting and warfare and stuff by channeling, you know, their pent up testosterone and that sort of stuff into competitive, you know, martial arts. So having controlled competitions. So and that actually helped cultivate Bruce Lee and make him more, I guess, I don't know, mature as a man, you could say. So that was really helpful to him in his early days.
You know, I think that's a great observation right there, because one of the things you often see said about Jordan Peterson, as I mentioned before, is that he's a hero to the alt-right. But I think if he's resonating with these people that we would consider members of the alt-right, it's not in the way that left-wing people think so much. It's in that, oh, he's validating our alt-right politics, but rather he's showing these folks in the alt-right that their politics are wrong and a waste and not constructive, and he's pulling them out of that political leaning. I think that's actually a great observation.
Exactly.
I think your comparison there between Ip Man and Bruce Lee, and then Jordan Peterson and a lot of these young men in the alt-right is really on point. That's actually what's going on. I just wanted to point that out real quick, but you can continue with where you were left off.
Oh, for sure. And that's sort of the thing I was trying to get across there. Is it's interesting, Ip Man's influence on Bruce Lee. Ultimately Bruce Lee ended up having a totally changed life path, where he became one of the most respected people in the world at the time. But so it's interesting to think what maybe Jordan Peterson, his effect might be having on some, you know, troubled alt-right men and that sort of stuff, and what path they might take in the future because of Jordan Peterson. So that's kind of an interesting. But anyway, so one thing that sort of Bruce Lee first started to encounter in terms of tribalism was in his Wing Chun studies, because there are a lot of Chinese students who would refuse to take the lessons alongside Bruce Lee because he was mixed race. So his mother, there's a lot of speculation onto exactly what she was Eurasian descent. So the thought is that apparently his grandfather on his mother's side was probably something like German, and his wife Linda Lee Cadwell, since his death, has suggested such in her interviews and that sort of thing. So it's probably something that was talked about between them. But it's something, probably his first big well, other than obviously the gang warfare, that's obvious tribalism. But I mean, other than that, he was rejected based on his own skin color in his own country. So that's something interesting to think about. But from there, he actually moved to San Francisco, and then spent a few months there before moving to Seattle. And so he was in West Coast of the U.S., and this was in the mid '60s. So this is right in the middle of the civil rights movement, which is really interesting to think. A Chinese descent guy moving to the U.S., and now he's going to encounter this tribalism and racism from the other side. So in Seattle, what he did was he worked in a restaurant for a while. There was a restaurateur, and in the area, so he was probably washing dishes and that sort of thing. But at the same time, he was also working on a high school degree. Eventually, he moved on to University of Washington, studied philosophy there, and there he was studying a lot of different minds, and he was well known for having a lot of books in his apartment where he lived. And he was usually a lot of different martial arts names as well as philosophy names. And one of the guys, for example, that he gained a lot of influence from, and this would influence his future, is Jiddu Krishnamurti. He's a Eastern philosopher, and one thing he focuses on is not seeking external validation, but being a light to yourself. So it's the ultimate form of truth, as he saw it. And while he was studying philosophy, he also was teaching Wing Chun on the side, and he was using his philosophy knowledge to sort of he realized that there were some limits to the traditional martial arts that he was learning. So he wanted to create the ultimate martial arts style that would be all encompassing and work for everybody. And as he was developing it, he started to call it Jun Fan Gung Fu, where Jun Fan is actually that was the name given to him by his father, and it's sort of a Cantonese for return home, because the idea was he was born in the U.S. They thought he was going to live in the U.S. for most of his life and then eventually return home. That was the idea, but it didn't really turn out that way. He grew up in China and then moved to the U.S., so it worked in reverse. But in any case, that Gung Fu style, he was teaching that, and one of his first students was a Japanese guy named Taki Kimura. And the reason that's important is this was really taboo at the time. I mean, for Chinese sifus to be teaching non-Chinese students kung fu, it was viewed as sort of aiding the enemy. You're sort of a race traitor if you did that. And I mean, he didn't care. He's University of Washington. He was teaching black students, the white students, and all that. One of his students was Linda Cadwell, who ended up marrying him. And I mean, that was another obvious spit in the face to the tribalism of the time. Was okay. Here's this Chinese descent guy who's going to marry, or who's going to start dating a white woman in the Western U.S. in the mid '60s. That was fair to say a little bit of a step out of bounds for the time. So, but anyway, it was sort of interesting that one observation I have about the time was the segregation that was going on in the U.S. at the time. It wasn't entirely government sort of induced, and it wasn't only working in the favor of white people. And this was a case where actually it wasn't working in white people's favor. It was, if you were white, you could not learn kung fu. It was not allowed, because no Chinese would teach you. You were seen as the enemy. It was the same thing if you were a black guy. You couldn't learn kung fu, or even an Asian who isn't the correct nationality. Taki Kimura was one of his first students, became his first sort of assistant instructor, and this was wildly revolutionary for the time. As a matter of fact, the Chinese community, they hated it so much that they tried to give him an ultimatum and say, stop teaching the enemy kung fu or else. And the or else was essentially they wanted to settle it by combat. So they wanted to hold a fight, and if Bruce Lee was to win that fight, then he would be allowed to teach whoever he wants, and if he lost, then no, he has to stop teaching non-Chinese his art. The guy that he fought, his name was Wong Jack Man. He was a well-decorated kung fu sifu of northern styles. So he was a Shaolin martial artist. And they actually had this. There were only a few witnesses to the fight. One was his girlfriend at the time, Linda. There was one of his top students was also there, and somebody from the Chinese community, as well as a few judges. The fight, it lasted, depending on who you ask, it could be anywhere between 3 minutes and 20 minutes. So that's obviously a big discrepancy in what's happening. But most people agree that Bruce Lee defeated Wong Jack Man and won his right to teach whoever the hell he wants. There's something I'm missing here that I was where I was going with this. Right. So what one piece that he took from this fight was, in his opinion, it took too long. His traditional sort of clinging to his Chinese heritage was preventing him from realizing his full potential. So this actually affected his future philosophy, and he realized that even his own supposed ultimate style, Junfan Kung Fu, it was insufficient. He needed a philosophy that was even less restrictive, and he called that Jeet Kune Do. So it's Jeet Kune Do is Cantonese for a way of the intercepting fist, and essentially what it was sort of a revolutionary. It was a revolutionary total rejection of tribalism in the martial arts world. So one thing that he did, because he was coming to the West, is he looked at some Western martial arts. So Western boxing, wrestling, Western fencing even, so sword play. And he looked at what was happening there that was making them effective. And he realized that part of it was their training methods. So in Eastern martial arts, there was a lot of dogma. It was almost like religion in a lot of cases. So if you study Kung Fu in a lot of schools, even today, one thing you'll find is that you don't have hard sparring. And for some of your listeners, what I mean by hard sparring is you don't pressure test your techniques against each other. In a safe environment where you could get hurt, but you're not going to kill each other essentially. But it's going to make you stronger as a martial artist, and it's going to show you what does work and what doesn't work. They would always have a reason for not doing that. They would say, "Oh, well, our techniques are too deadly. You can't pressure test them." But of course, the question becomes, how is your technique deadly? How do you know it's deadly if you haven't tested it? But that sort of drove the stagnation for a long time. But he looked at Western boxing and wrestling and realized that they didn't look at it that way at all. They were going hard, all out in their sparring. Because of it, he had some very controversial observations, at least in terms of the pretentious martial arts community at the time, that maybe Western boxers are punching better than we are. And I mean, looking back at it now, it's kind of absurd to think that was considered a weird thing to say, that maybe boxers are punching better than we are.
Right.
But in any case, this Jeet Kune Do, it was a beautiful marriage of Eastern and Western philosophy. It took the training techniques of the Western combative arts. So you'll notice that one weird thing that he does in his martial arts is he will lead with his dominant hand, which is his right hand, and you would call that what you typically see in almost every martial art, including boxing, is they'll teach you to lead with your non-dominant hand. So you'll lead with your left if you're right-handed, because you have your right hand cocked back and you can throw a powerful strike with it or something like that. But his idea was, and he was borrowing this actually from fencing, was you lead with your dominant hand because you're going to be doing the most with it. So you're going to be doing your jabs, you're going to be doing your parrying, you're going to be doing your lead kicks, that sort of thing. But one thing that he didn't take from the Western philosophy was all the rules in place. So if you're actually in boxing, you're training to just punch. If you're in wrestling, you're training to not be allowed to punch. If you're training in fencing, you're training to use a sword. So that's where the East was bringing the right idea and not restricting their number of techniques essentially that they could use. So he was marrying the Eastern and Western philosophies, and he made something that was totally American in its nature. It was coming to the New World and fusing these ideas into a single concept that was just totally American. And a lot of martial artists, they're screaming in their heads right now, listening to me, because they're saying, no, it's totally Eastern. He keeps quoting Jiddu Krishnamurti, and it's influenced by Taoism and all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, okay, sure, but at the same time, if you think about what the American philosophy is, it's assimilation. It's taking your spice and adding it to the pot. So so what he did with it was he said, okay, any technique is welcome in my philosophy, in Jeet Kune Do. Any technique is welcome as long as it assimilates to some core principles. Like in Jeet Kune Do, you have totality, efficiency. He equated it to a sculptor who doesn't add clay to make a statue. They sculpt away what isn't necessary. And of course, effectiveness. As long as it adheres to those principles, then it's welcome in the Jeet Kune Do philosophy. And that's actually something interesting. Is he's somebody who believed that you should never teach martial arts without discrimination. And what I mean by that is if you look at most traditional martial arts classes, they are taught in a very egalitarian, no discrimination fashion. Everyone will line up and here, let's do your forms. Let's all practice our punching. Let's all practice our kicking. Let's all pair up and do the same drill, that sort of thing. He rejected that idea because if you look at the diversity of the people he was teaching women who were, very small and didn't have the upper body strength. So it didn't make a lot of sense to him to be teaching them, a lot of punching drills and boxing. Instead, work on their flexibility and their kicking power. And if he had gone a little longer, he probably would have focused more on the jiu-jitsu grappling. That was after his time.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But also
focusing on female core strength, maybe.
Sure, exactly. Yeah. And one of his students who was actually interviewed, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So obviously he's a ridiculously tall guy, basketball player at the time. And he had a fairly amusing interview because one thing he was confronted with was, okay, so a guy like me, who's 6'11", whatever he was, why would I work on my judo techniques? Judo, for those who don't know, it's a style of martial arts where a lot of it revolves around grappling and throws, where you have to get your hips underneath somebody's center of gravity in order to throw them. That would make no sense at all for somebody like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It would be ridiculous to think about. So, and it's not discrimination based on group. It's discrimination based on individuals and their own capabilities and their own builds and all that sort of stuff. It was the ultimate individual focus, I guess you could say, where it's sort of, and Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, is with the identity politics and trying to use intersectionality and, well, I'm this and this and this. Well, why don't you just go all the way and be an individual from the start? So it's kind of interesting that it sort of mirrors that in the martial arts world.
All right. So you're saying that
But
basically,
anyway,
there Bruce Lee adapted his teaching methods to say, okay, I'm going to look at how your inherent differences will sort of compel you to take different pathways in martial arts, because some of you are taller than others, some of you are stockier than others, some of you are more flexible than others, and we need to build a martial arts style that fits you as you are and not have everyone doing the same drills in tandem. That's basically what he's saying, right?
for sure, yeah.
Right, and that sort of compares
And
to
as a
the
matter of
culture
fact,
wars, right? Like that compares to
oh,
the culture wars in the sense that like the people who want equity want basically everyone to be practicing their punches and their kicks in tandem, as if that's going to work out the same way for everyone, when in fact it won't. And we instead need to develop our system that speaks honestly about inherent differences and adapts to them rather than tries to pretend that they are not there. Is that the parallel you're drawing here?
I think so. Yeah, that's actually a very good way to kind of summarize that piece of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Um, so the I guess the other bit was he's to me somebody who embodied the American dream, like totally embodied the American dream. He came to the U.S. with very little, didn't have his education, but he applied his own merit in every possible way. Learned English, assimilated to different American ideas like entrepreneurship. Opened his own martial arts school and built himself up from there. Philosophy, used that to create his own martial art. If he didn't do that, if he didn't apply his new ideas, he would just be another kung fu teacher, and nobody would ever know who he was. He would have made enough to get by and that sort of thing. But in any case, he came to the U.S., assimilated, created his own business, and he even got into acting, which a lot of people would stereotypically say is the American dream because of Hollywood. But if you want to talk about overcoming adversity, I mean, have you ever watched the TV show Kung Fu with David Carradine?
I have not seen that show. No.
Okay, well, the idea behind that show, and it ran for a very long time, is there's a guy, there was a Shaolin monk, and he had a long lost son who was in America. So he went to America to sort of find his son, and the whole TV show was his story of walking, sort of traveling about the U.S. looking for his son and overcoming challenges using his Eastern martial arts philosophy, but also teaching people his culture as he went along. That TV show was Bruce Lee's idea, and he was meant to be the star of that show, but he was rejected for the lead role because he was too Oriental for it, which is pretty flippantly ridiculous if you think about it. I mean, it's called Kung Fu. It's about a Shaolin monk. It's about a guy teaching Westerners Eastern philosophy, and he was too Chinese, too damn Chinese for it.
Did
So
they
that sort
cast
of
a white
shows
guy?
you some of the. Pardon?
Did they cast a white guy in the lead role?
Yeah, so sort of a dark-skinned white guy who could sort of pass for, Native American almost, I guess, David Carradine.
Uh,
And I think the quality of the show suffered a great deal because of that. Because I mean, David Carradine, he's decent as an actor, but I mean, in terms of actual martial arts, he's the, I don't know, the slowest bastard I've ever seen in terms of choreographed movements and that sort of stuff. If they had somebody like Bruce Lee, that would have been an insanely good TV show. But I mean, the series ran for a very long time. But it really shows you what kind of actual racism that he was encountering. But I mean, he overcame it. He was Green Hornets. He was his sidekick Kato and that, and he in my opinion, totally overshadowed Green Hornet because he was just too good, damn good at the fight scenes. But probably his pinnacle Hollywood achievement was Enter the Dragon, which just made so much money. Unfortunately, he wasn't even alive to see that happen because he died before it was released. But probably tragically, his passion project was a movie called Game of Death, and that was shaping up to be an insanely good movie that was not about Hollywood spectacle. It was more about teaching everyone his philosophy. The sort of end piece of the movie was going to have him fight 5 levels of a pagoda, and each different level of the pagoda was going to be somebody who represents a different style. So at the bottom level was going to be I think it was going to be his student Taki Kimura was going to play somebody with a karate style. The second level was going to be somebody who represents Chinese mantis kung fu. And then the actual scenes that he filmed are just very good. If you ever look up Game of Death, just the recorded footage by Bruce Lee, you'll find that the last 3 levels are one of his students. He's a Filipino Kali martial artist, so you get to see him use his nunchucks, and the guy is trying to fight him with weapons and that sort of stuff. Bruce Lee beats him. Next level up is a master of Hapkido named Ji Han-jae, a really tall Korean guy. So he fights him, and each level is more challenging. When he gets to the top, it's the style of the unknown. So essentially, it's representing how the encounter between 2 individuals, and the guy who plays that part is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So it shows you, and he has a really difficult go of it, and you can see he's almost the way he portrays his difficulty in overcoming another individual is just a masterpiece of art. It's a damn shame that he died before he could finish that. But one thing that I want to sort of close on, just as an aside on Bruce Lee, is it's important to note that his Jeet Kune Do philosophy is not pluralism. So it's not saying that all ideas are equally good. So I don't know if you I don't know if you guys in the U.S. learn it this way, but when we're in sort of middle school and high school, we learn about 2 different concepts to culture. One is we call the Canadian cultural quilt, or multiculturalism, and one is we call it the U.S. model of the melting pot, or assimilation. I don't know if you guys learned it that way or not. Is that the case? Or?
I don't think we learned it as the melting pot, and I think I don't know if assimilation is quite how it's been typically conveyed explicitly, but there is this idea that you can just keep throwing more stuff in, and you're just getting a concoction that's even more American with every ingredient added, basically. And I see what the idea of the quilt is more like. With a melting pot, there's no longer a gradient of differences among the components, whereas with a quilt, each square, there's the borders are clear, even if they all add up to a whole.
Yeah, that's actually a very good way to think of it. With the cultural quilt model, the way I kind of see it is it's completely separate cultures altogether, that you almost do away with the idea of assimilation altogether, where you just have separate cultures in the same area that are bound by the same quilt, so the same boundary. So it's all in the same country, but it's completely different cultures. And the idea behind it is that that's supposed to be more tolerant and less racist and all that sort of stuff. But I've seen that as kind of a failed experiment in Canada, because we have all of the problems that multiculturalism is supposed to fix. And it's something where I totally disagree with our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he would say that we should aim for pluralism. He's actually said that, and I would totally disagree with him. I think that the U.S. sort of melting pot model has worked better, and they're starting to abandon that model and move towards multiculturalism at their peril, in my opinion. And I'm wondering what your opinion on that is in terms of what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah, so I think to a point we've aspired to be a melting pot. There's been an extent to which that hasn't actually been the case. I mean, if you look at the reality that has been segregation and racial discrimination, in a way, that's sort of a quilt system with more of a negative undertone, right? Where people are
Sure.
forced to be in separate squares on the quilt, and the melting pot idea hasn't really, I think, been given quite as much of a fair shot until about starting 50 years ago, and even then, not completely. The melting pot idea had a bit more prominence with different European cultures and races that came. I mean, there's this idea in the United States of white people being a race, but that's a surprisingly non-comforting concept in Europe. The idea that, oh, we're all just white people in it together is not stopping the nationalist movements that are occurring in those countries. It's not. It didn't stop Brexit, right? The idea that
Right.
other people are white like you. I mean, it's like a lot of it just comes down to the fact you're not the right kind of white people. You look at what informed Nazi ideology. A lot of people have this idea that if you're just a white supremacist, then that's synonymous with being a neo-Nazi. Well, not really. And neo-Nazis were specifically in favor of the Nordic-centric concept of Aryanism. Aryanism being a racial grouping. This is just another way of saying white people. You could say the term white isn't probably as relevant by the Nazi ideologues who developed it because it makes sense here in America because there were black people to differentiate from us. So if we say they're black, and with Native Americans, they were sometimes called the red man, right? The colors actually stood out, but within the context of European society, that's not really the case. So you're not going to use it in terms of white or whatever. And so the idea of the Nazi ideology was that there's all these white people, but not all of them are the right kind of white people. And this is evidenced by how they are going to eradicate people like the Jews and the Slavs. I mean, they said, well, we're going to completely annihilate these ethnic groups. And that's sort of an extreme example of what has always underscored European identity concepts. It's not around whiteness. So the fact that there is a concept of whiteness here in America implies that there's been some successful melting pot mechanism, because the fact that that people are Calvinist and Episcopal and Catholic is no longer relevant. There's a common identity they have. The fact that they're Irish or English or French or German or Polish doesn't really matter so much because there's been a successful, and it wasn't always that easy. I mean, at first there was preference for Western Europeans over Eastern Europeans. Gradually that stopped.
And Irish need not apply and that sort of thing, yeah.
Right, and so the melting pot's been successful for white people. So it's sort of a partial thing where the quilt is more realistically what we've done in some cases. The melting pot's been what has been the case for just white people. I mean, you can make the argument that the majority of America's population is white, so it's been the thing that's applied to most Americans, but I don't know if that's a particularly useful argument to make. In any event, I do think, though, that with the gains we've made since the Civil Rights era, where we've actually really been able to commit to the melting pot model wholeheartedly, and I think the melting pot model is just the logical extension of the Enlightenment discoveries. by the social and political philosophers of that era. I think that we've seen a lot of benefits from it. I think while not all the, we'll say, leftover quilt, while not all the quilt system leftovers are gone, we've been able to blur the lines between the squares and move toward common humanity in the last half century. And we're starting to lose progress on that now with the current direction of the culture wars, since the SJW movement really took off in about 2013. But up to that point, we were, I think, making a lot of progress socially and culturally. And I think pluralism is not quite as effective at making us a strong and capable and ultimately more prosperous society, because working together we're able to do a lot more. Right. I mean, in times of crisis, you want the nation to be unified. And we've been able to do that pretty successfully at many points. You know, the only real problem we had in doing that was the Civil War. And thankfully, you might say the melting pot is won that conflict. Because if you look at the what the South was trying to defend, it was more of a quilt type of structure for society, a very harsh and toxic type of quilt society. But then that leads you to wonder, is that a necessary or inherent part of a quilt system? That it's just because there's not as much, there's not a sense of oneness that comes with it in the same way that the melting pot does. Maybe there will always be something a little toxic. And maybe pluralism, trying to pursue pluralism, maybe that effectively compels us to be at conflict with each other when we do not need to be.
Right. I agree with probably 90% of that. One distinction that I would make, I think, is when you apply the cultural quilt to sort of the segregation policies and sort of slavery and that sort of stuff that the South was sort of championing. What I would say is, I don't know that I would call it or at least not the same quilt model, because multiculturalism is a sort of separate but equal concept. Whereas this was a quilt where those different squares were not equal. They were one was subject to another. It was sort of
right.
It was sort of like the South African, apartheid hierarchy system. So it was a little bit different from
some squares were made of silk and other squares were made of flax, kind of thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it, I think. Yeah. But anyway, I think you're very right in terms of yes, the melting pot being what you should aim for, and that it wasn't always what you guys have achieved. It's the direction that I think we should move in, because that's what made North America successful overall, was the idea of the melting pot. Because in Canada's early history, that's the reason that people also flocked to Canada, is because in name we were multicultural, but there was also a lot of melting pot aspects to it, especially for, like you say, Western Europeans, and not even just Western Europeans, just Europeans in general. Because that was the bulk of the immigrant population. It didn't work out so well for the Indigenous peoples. It worked out a little bit better in Canada for Black people and that sort of thing. But despite what you might have heard, our history isn't that kind to people of color. Like, we were the end of the Underground Railway, but at the same time, we were also very racist in our early history, because that wasn't a unique thing. That was just the way of the world at the time. So, but anyway, I guess in terms of tribalism, one thing I wanted to talk about was that it's a big threat to productive conversation, and I wanted to propose sort of a question to you, because Jordan Peterson's his lectures on sort of temperament and how it applies to the right-left dichotomy. So when he talks about sort of conscientiousness and openness and
Yes.
discuss sensitivity and stuff.
Yes.
So just based on my own observation, there seems to be a lot to that based on people who hold themselves in those different dichotomies and how they sort of carry themselves. Because this, because these sort of temperaments, they're sort of part of a person's nature. To what extent do you think that sort of limits the potential of discourse?
I think there is a pretty significant extent to which this can limit discourse. So I'll go ahead and do the general thesis statement there. Because, and I've seen this for myself, and I run into this a lot, being a centrist. So I have moments of openness. I have moments where I'm more closed to things, and I hop between the two. And so I have butted heads with people who are more liberal, people who are more conservative, and sometimes these folks have come out of the situation thinking, well, if it's the conservative, I'm a super left Marxist, and if it's liberal, I'm a alt-right kind of person. And a lot of what ends up happening here is that when the way you think is so different, the existence of a common language is so difficult to construct. It's not even so much that people disagree, but it's like trying to do things in inches versus centimeters without any conversion tables or anything. Just imagine how effective that's going to be. It's not going to be effective. And underlying values and things that people identify as important generally can be so different that people look at things very differently. So we'll talk about the idea of government, for example, right? Some conservatives look at Soviet Union and just all the communist regimes of the 20th century as being very tyrannical and murderous. And in addition to that, even the more benign ones have had efficiency problems that led to lack of growth and, in many cases, mass starvation. Right, so that's a problem, and their idea is that, of course, allowing people to do whatever they want and be free is most effective, because then people are able to discover what's more efficient. If there's no rules put on them, right? The government says you can't do this, you might not stumble into a great idea, and then no one's there to capitalize on it. Whereas, people who are more sympathetic to the state having a role in the economy, see things like, well, you have all this efficiency, but then it stacks so high at the top, and there are people at the bottom who are, if you're homeless in America, there's very little you can do at that point. You're basically fucked. A lot of people won't help you. A lot of people won't trust you. They assume that if you're homeless, it's because you have a drug problem, or you're violent, or a criminal record kind of thing, and that often is the case. But there are people who end up homeless because their parents were bigoted against them when they came out as homosexual and kicked them out of the house, and their part-time jobs at McDonald's didn't pay for rent, allow them to get an apartment, and all their other friends were people in the church who don't approve of that either. So where are they going to go except the sidewalk, right? And then if you end up in that way for 3 years, you look like a dirty, untrustworthy hobo in the minds of a lot of people. Who's going to give you a chance? What kind of employer is going to want to hire you, right? So it's a thing that can feed into itself. It's like a reverse Pareto effect. And then, of course, very wealthy people who have a lot of wealth, even though that's a private form of power and influence, they'll leverage it into public and political power and influence through bribing politicians and stuff. So the liberals see that, right? And they're like, oh, this is a problem. Now, what's interesting is liberals and conservatives often do prefer some kind of a market system. They're so genuinely paranoid of each other that they result to extremist statements because they're only saying the worst on the other side and none of the good, right? Like, there are bad things that corporations do, but corporations are great mathematical systems for efficiency in a way that the state isn't. But at the same time, corporations have biases, right? They can't see beyond their own balance sheet, really. Like, they can't see the effect of what they dumped in the river 1,000 miles downstream, right? But the government can see that.
Right.
The government is in charge of everything. So the government sees what the companies don't see. And I mean, I look at it like this. And this comes from some of my background having been in the military and my own study of military history. But basically, in the 19th century, the Prussian general Helmuth von Moltke the Elder revolutionized the method of military organization because he was basically the bridge from the linear Napoleonic era to the current style of that would later encompass 20th century warfare. At least conceptually, a lot of his ideas didn't take hold right away. But basically, he said, okay, populations are growing, militaries are growing. The size of militaries are so big and complex that there's no longer just like a single battle on one battlefield, and that can determine the fate of the war. It is way bigger, more. There's like a whole line that spans the border of the country. There's going to be several simultaneous skirmishes, and he had ideas of like there's a whole complex total war aspect. So he basically said, okay, there's so many variables in war now with the growth of population and technology that a commander can't like play a perfect game of chess and win. Instead, he just has to identify the general things that need to occur and then allow his lower commanders who are commanding different units to figure out the specifics as they go. It's like, okay, so here's generally what you need to do. Here's your general mission. Like, take this hill, right? What you need to navigate and overcome to get the hill is for the lower commander to figure out. Because then the commander of the whole military better have to figure out the minutia of every hill that needs to be captured. That's too much. He doesn't have that time, right? So spreading the cognitive load a bit. In a way, I see this as sort of being like what the ideal system is in economics is you want the government to figure out the do's and the don'ts, and then just sort of through regulation and taxation, basically spell those out for entrepreneurs, businesses, corporations. Like, don't dump cyanide in the river. Okay, it's bad form. But at the same time, the government can't micromanage every economic decision. Right? The government can't figure out what's going to make me better off as an individual. It can't do that times 300 million in the United States. So it has to set some overarching goals that you just can't violate and understand the big picture. And companies need to respect what some of these big picture things are, but they need to be given some of the freedom to discover efficiencies where they open up, because that's sort of the blind spot that the government has. Is it can see everything from above, but it's too far away. It doesn't have a microscope to see everything at once. Whereas the businesses can see the local picture. So that system of military organization was very effective for Helmuth von Moltke. Prussia went on to win 3 wars in a row decisively against Denmark and against Austria and then against France. And in fact, these were the wars that led Germany to be unified under the Prussian monarchy and not the Austrian monarchy, forming the German Empire. These methods of military organizing are basically, it's the same basic system that every modern military uses today. And it's the system under which I was trained to be an officer when I was an Army cadet in college. This is basically like, here's the general principles that you get from your commander. You're the unit leader. You have to figure out the specific plan to get what we want, right? It's communicating intent. So that's sort of the system that I see right now. That's a very nuanced look that people with their visceral reactions, like, oh my God, the communists, look what they did. And then, oh my God, the capitalists, look what they did. A lot of people just aren't going to see that very quickly. And when they don't try to see the benefits of the other side, like, yeah, the commander knows well knows best, but the lower ranked officers also know best. There's this bizarre idea that one person is right and therefore the other person is wrong. But sometimes both people are right and sometimes both people are wrong. And this makes communication very difficult because that's just not how people tend to be wired to think. And the way a lot of
binaries are a lot more simple.
Yeah, the way things are set up now, especially the way social media is done and with clickbaity YouTube videos and article headlines, it's not allowing for that kind of nuanced look to take place, where you have the realization that von Moltke had about 160 years ago. And so, yeah, I'm not very optimistic about that because that's sort of the system that we need to go for, where we realize the use of markets as well as the use of the state, that they each have their own lane that they need to stay in, and that the real conversation is where does one lane begin and the other start. And that might shift a bit over time based on cultural changes, based on economic changes, based on technological changes. And so we need to have a healthy dialogue to do that. And based on some of the research of Jonathan Haidt, I think we were actually a little bit better at doing that because he'll point out that before roughly the 1990s and late 80s even, there wasn't as much political polarization. You had folks who had their party preference, but
is this from Coddling of the American Mind? Because that's a
yeah. This is from that. Yeah, this is from that and some of his other stuff. There was a lot more overlap between Democrats and Republicans, the leaders and the voters, in terms of the things they wanted. And what kind of economic system did we have then? Just because this is interesting, right? We had a very Keynesian system, which is a happy marriage of government and the market, which you don't really see that as much today. When the polarization continued, you basically saw a mass abandonment of Keynesianism and more of a push toward untethered markets, and then so you have folks that are basically like, I love capitalism, everything in capitalism is perfect, and then you have folks who, because there are problems that came with this, like the 2008 recession is a direct result of the trajectory of deregulation that occurred starting in the 80s. People reacted to that extreme, like, oh, capitalism can never be trusted. We got to go socialism, and they're forgetting about the stuff that happened under the Cold War. Maybe because it was so long ago, a lot of the really worst parts, and then of course they didn't live under it like they're living under the flaws and fallout of flawed capitalism. And so that's one thing. It's like we've been going apart, and it's been decades where it's really difficult. I was hoping. I guess you might have been hoping for maybe more like, yes, there's a problem, but here's how we get around it. But it's actually extremely difficult to overcome, even within the Democratic Party. I will say, just stay in one party and try to do that. It is tough.
Right. Oh, totally. And I know I'm glad I got more of a thesis from you, because no, it's because yeah, I was hoping that would spark a sort of a little bit of a longer rant from you. So yeah, and I would mostly agree with what you said. I might have some disagreements about what caused the global financial problems in 2008. Like I would personally say that a lot of that had to do with bailing out the banks, which is really corporatism and not capitalism. But yes, that's definitely like, as a matter of fact. So because you mentioned you're a centrist, that's really interesting to me, because I think that's a sort of a self criticism is sort of a weird concept to a centrist, because a centrist is everything and nothing, really. Does that sort of make sense?
Yes.
But in terms of discourse and rejection of tribalism, I've noticed that in the history of this podcast, that you've so far had primarily left-leaning sort of guests, and yet a lot of the criticism has been towards the left. So I found that really interesting. And in the spirit of that, I figured that as a right-winger, I would maybe bring up some bones that I have to pick with the right, especially as of late. Does that sound like a good idea?
Shoot. Yep.
Okay. So I'll start with just a little story. I'm not sure how familiar you are with how the Canadian parliamentary system works, but in terms of elections, it works a lot like it does in the US. So we just basically use different words for the same shit that happens in the US. So you have districts, we have ridings. You have the electoral college, we have the parliamentary seat system. We have a prime minister, you have a president, so it's same shit, different pile. So we recently had a total change of regime, you could say. We had the conservative government ruling for it was about 9 years, had an election, and the Liberals took over under Justin Trudeau. And afterwards, the Conservatives started to do sort of their equivalent of what in the US would be the kind of primary system. So choosing their new leader. Because the former Stephen Harper, after he lost, he stayed an MP for a while. And by the way, MP is a member of parliament, which is basically like a congressman. Stayed an MP for a little while and sort of got out of the business. And they were choosing their new leader for the Conservative Party. And they do it by a vote. And I don't know if it works this way in the US, but in Canada, in order to vote for who the new leader of the Conservative Party will be, you have to pay for a membership in the Conservative Party. I don't know if it works that way with the Republicans and the Democrats in the US. Does it? Or
it's a bit different, but it's kind of similar. Yeah. I don't know that there's anything.
All right, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fair. Okay. Yeah. So, so we have sort of three major parties that tend to gain various amounts of power in Canada, as opposed to the two parties in the US. Our Conservative Party is very much ideologically somewhat close to what the Republicans, at least in name, are. Not so much under Donald Trump, but just sort of historically. The Liberal Party is very much in line with a lot of what the Democrats are, whereas we also have a party called the NDP, or the New Democratic Party, which is really just like it's sort of a much further left, or a little bit further left party, more along the lines of some more social democrat type stuff. Where anyway, the point is, I actually had a stake in this conservative leadership election because there was a candidate I really liked named Maxime Bernier. He's a Quebecois guy, so French speaker, and he had a lot of his platform was a lot more libertarian than conservative. So I wanted him to win. So I bought a membership, voted for him, and he almost won. He was just barely beat out by another guy named Andrew Scheer. But anyway, on the night that they were having this vote, the Conservative Party invited all the members out to here in Ottawa. They held a party at a pub just to watch the results. So I decided to go, and that was kind of interesting because you see a little bit of the diversity of who calls themselves a conservative there, and the party was sort of run by. It was bizarre to see because it was, I don't know, he was a politician out of a movie essentially. He was, you know how you see sort of the movie stereotype politician where their hair is combed just the right way, and just the right shoes, not too nice, not too shabby, just a little bit of a scuff on the shoe, and
Yeah, I see those people all the time.
Yeah, yeah, like he just looked almost like shiny, if that makes sense. But yeah, so we were there, sort of having some beers and bullshitting over watching the results, and one of the guys that was talking with me, and he'd been part of the party for a long time. Um, he said something that just, I don't know, it was really upsetting to me. He uh, what he because I was making the case for Maxime Bernier because he was more principled, and he had a more libertarian sort of economic standpoint, whereas he was okay with regulating what uh, a conservative would say need to be regulated, but not if it sacrifices trade and all this other stuff. And I had said, yeah, sure, but Andrew Scheer is more likely to win. And I thought, well, and I actually said to him, it's not a goddamn hockey game. If his platform isn't principled, then why do you want him to win at all? And he actually said, I would rather win than be right. And to me, that was just really upsetting. And that was just another tribalism punch to the face for me. And that was it made me realize what was going on in a lot of right-wing politics was they would rather appeal to sort of populism and win rather than be principled and actually have something to fight for. So that's sort of a criticism that I have with the right as of late is inconsistency and sort of hypocrisy, you could say. Like a good example of that is have you noticed how there's seems to be a really short memory? It wasn't very long ago. I mean, I'm turning 30 tomorrow, but I'm not that damn old. I remember. I seem to remember when Vladimir Putin was the corrupt commie bastard that we shouldn't trust as far as we can throw him, and that was a right-wing position. And as a matter of fact, in Canada, our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper of the Conservative Party, one of his proudest moments was saying right to Putin's face, get out of Ukraine. So this is only, we're talking 7 years ago, something like that. So why is it that suddenly Putin he's a man's man. He's cool. Watch, he rides bears, and he's kicking out the terrorists, and he says fuck the Muslims, and yeah, let's make being gay illegal. That's he's a man's man. He's cool, and yeah, he's what we should shoot for. Oh, so what if people are stuffing ballots and all that sort of shit? And suddenly they've totally forgotten what they knew 10 years ago, and they're pro-Putin, and a lot of it is because Putin wanted Trump to win. So I don't know. Have you noticed that in terms of the Putin thing? Or?
I've definitely noticed that a bit. I mean, there was a lot of controversy. This is more so when Bush was president still, so a good while ago. But there was he did the same thing in Ukraine that he did with Georgia and South Ossetia, and Bush was not happy about that. And here's the thing. Here's the really fucked up thing about it. He did both of these things in the middle of the Olympics while people aren't looking. He stole South Ossetia during the 2008 Summer Olympics, and then he stole Crimea during the 2014 Winter Olympics. And it's interesting he did that twice. And when it happened under Bush, it showed him on TV vigorously talking to Putin in the middle of the game, like, oh, there's President Bush talking to Putin. What's going on? Like, next day on the news, It's like, oh, yesterday Russia invaded South Ossetia and took it. Like,
just as sort of a aside.
We caught that moment in real time. That was just crazy. And it's like, back then the Republicans weren't happy about that, but now they're totally content with all this stuff. And they'll let Putin get away with anything. And then that's just crazy to me because
he would justify it.
Yeah, He was a KGB agent for the Soviet Union. He's not our friend.
Yeah. If ever there is going to be somebody that doesn't trust that guy, it should be the right wing. You would think, but it's not the case lately because he supported Trump in his sort of run, I guess. That's probably the biggest reason for it.
That's a sad thing. Well, anyway, we're coming up.
But the thing is,
yeah, we're just coming up on the end of the time here. I just want to point that out. I'd like to let your your last thoughts in though.
Sure, yeah. So I guess just I want to return to sort of the Bruce Lee stuff and talk a little bit about personal growth for a minute, and just say in the analogy I have, when you're talking with somebody who disagrees with you, or even somebody who doesn't disagree with you, rejecting tribalism is like your Jeet Kune Do tool, where discourse is your equivalent of hard sparring. So that hard sparring and then your discourse, even if you don't convince somebody, even if you don't change their mind, it's going to make you stronger. So remember that. Reject tribalism, and discourse is your friend. And I just sort of want to sort of close with a nice quote. Bruce Lee said, "Under the sky, under the heavens, there is but one family." So on Earth, we got one tribe, 7 billion brothers and sisters, 7 billion individuals. Discourse and martial arts have the same objective, and that's arresting the flow of conflict. So I guess I'll sort of leave it off to you.
All right. Well, you know what? This has been a really fascinating discussion. I love hearing how the advancements that Bruce Lee made map in martial arts specifically, how they map very well into the same kind of advancements we can make culturally and politically with how we discuss the issues. Thanks for opening the door to that for the rest of us, and hopefully we'll hear more of what you have to say on that if you ever have any further thoughts about these parallels in another episode of the podcast. So thanks for coming on, Mike.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.